Hey, and welcome to the sixth part of our Hermeneutics Academy. Hope you're enjoying this so far. In this session, we're going to be looking at Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament. It's really important that we get to know how the Jews interpreted Scripture, so that we can better understand how to read their interpretations of it, if that makes sense. So, how do we know what Paul is thinking when he writes a certain thing if we don't know how he's interpreting things that we may have interpreted slightly differently? So, we might interpret the book of Isaiah as being all about David's time and all about the new king to come in the kingdom then and all that sort of stuff. Whereas maybe another Christian might interpret it as this is all about Jesus. And because we see Jesus and then we look back in Scripture and we see it in hindsight with Jesus being involved. But Paul and the people around Paul, the Jews, would have interpreted it slightly differently and certainly wouldn't have been looking back at Scripture a lot of the time in terms of having Jesus in it. Obviously, Paul would have done that quite a lot, but in terms of the people around him and the people that he's speaking to, they would have been looking at things a certain way, and so he would have been trying to speak into their culture in their way. And so we need to take these things into account. So let me tell you two ways in which Jews would interpret the Scripture. Basically, for them, Old Testament was all about the law of God. It was all about keeping the law of God, the rules of God, the morals of God, and essentially it was all about making sure that they are holy. As you can imagine, they had a torrid time of warfare and all that sort of stuff, being under the rule of the Greeks and then the Romans and then lots of other different like kings and stuff. And so they believed that this was all because they believed that this was all because they were sinful. They believed that it's because that their nation was sinful. And so the only way to be set free and liberated from the barbaric rule of the Romans was to become holy. So everything about the Jewish culture, about Scripture and about religion was all about keeping the law under any circumstances. So there were different ways in which the Jewish people would interpret Scripture or would interpret the law of God. One of them was called the Midrashic way of interpreting Scripture or the law of God. Keeping in mind that the law wasn't all written down; some of it was oral law as well, tradition and stuff. So essentially, what they would do is over time they would add oral law and interpretations of Scripture into their sort of traditional mindset and the rules and laws that govern their religion. So and the oral law and the traditions were just as important as the written law. And so the Midrashic way of interpreting Old Testament would have been that they chose laws and rules. They lived by laws and rules that had to have a biblical or scriptural written evidence for its being. Okay, so you can imagine where God says, "Do not murder." That's quite easy. We don't murder, So that's a solid rule. That's we keep that rule. Whereas maybe someone might say, well, you shouldn't accidentally commit homicide, not homicide. Sorry, you shouldn't accidentally commit what we would call today like an accidental death. And then maybe that was like an oral law, but it wasn't written in Scripture. And so what would happen is, because there were different ways of interpreting the Scripture, the Midrashic way would be to only essentially do the rule that is written, whereas there was another way of interpreting which was Mishrashic. It's hard to say, isn't it? Mishrashic, which was essentially to take into account the oral traditions and the oral laws that were added in and interpreted into the Scriptures that we find. So essentially there's two different ways of weighing up how we live our lives and how we see the outworking of the law of God or the Scriptures in our lives. And so for the Jewish person, some would be Midrashic and some would be Mishrashic. So Midrashic, Scripture only. Mishrashic, tradition also. So there's another thing that the Jews also did quite a lot, which was their genealogies. They were so obsessed with genealogies. They were obsessed with backstories. They were obsessed with like hierarchy and really selling someone. So what they would do often is if someone didn't have a big enough genealogy to represent who they were, so maybe someone was like really rich, done really well in life, they're a great businessman, they're doing amazing, but they came from nothing. Instead of telling everyone that they came from nothing, they would make up a genealogy. So when you read in Matthew and Luke the genealogy of Jesus, that is like very Jewish. It's a very Jewish thing to do, to be so obsessed with the genealogy. We need to prove that Jesus is of good stock by letting you know that he went through these lines. And it's so interesting to see that for Matthew, Matthew's gospel sort of paints this picture of Jesus being the descendant of all these really, really important people, going all the way down through like David and then like Adam and Abraham and all these different people, So for Matthew, he wants to let the Jews know that Jesus is a supremely important Jewish person. Whereas Luke, on the other hand, takes a slightly different stance and adds in Gentiles who were seen as outsiders and dirty, and women and people like that, And it's just interesting that Luke is almost saying, Jesus himself came from a genealogy of poor people and outcasts and people that were not the same as everyone else. And so you can see the two different sort of this is who Jesus is, and they're both trying to paint a different picture using the genealogy. Essentially, say if I was a Jewish person, because my family may be not noble and all that sort of stuff. If I was a preacher and if I was a really good preacher, what they would do then is they would make up a genealogy for me. They would make one up that's totally fabricated to show that I'm important through this fake genealogy. Then as they make it up, then somehow weirdly it becomes truth. But they were so obsessed with genealogies that essentially almost became like a little sect in the days of the early church and stuff. And people were so obsessed with that sort of stuff. But it's important that we know these sort of ways of interpreting Scripture. Why are there so many genealogies? Why are there so many people talking about, who are you the stock of? Who are you the descendant of, and all that sort of stuff? Why is that sort of stuff important? I hope that this has been helpful to you and that you're going to go away and research some more the Midrashic interpretation of the Old Testament and the Mishrashic interpretation of the Old Testament. I look forward to our next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.